It's not gravity, not in the way you've been told. It's not collagen loss, though collagen loss is real. It's not fat redistribution, though the fat does move. It's not genetics, though genetics shapes the timeline. These things are all happening, and none of them is the explanation for the specific pattern of jowl formation that most of us will recognize in ourselves or people we love. What the conventional model doesn't explain is this. Why do two people with identical skin type, identical age, nearly identical sun exposure history present with dramatically different jaw definition? Why does one person at 60 have a jawline that reads as structurally intact, while someone at 52, well hydrated, well rested, collagen supplemented, does not? If this were purely a story about collagen and ultraviolet exposure and time, the distribution of jowl severity would track those variables closely. It doesn't always. There's a structural variable the conventional model mostly ignores, and it's not in the face. It's approximately 2 feet below it, the ribcage. Specifically, what happens when the ribcage has been slowly, quietly losing dimension over decades, contracting inward in the way that seated posture, forward head position, and the kind of shallow upper chest breathing most of us have fallen into almost universally in modern life, all encourage. When the ribcage compresses chronically, something gets transmitted upward through a continuous sheet of connective tissue that most anatomy classes barely touch, and the face is at the receiving end of that transmission. The connective tissue is called fascia, and the particular fascial chain we're interested in is the one Thomas Myers mapped in his work on myofascial meridians, a body of research called Anatomy Trains, which for the first time gave anatomists a systematic framework for understanding how load travels through the body, not just through bone and muscle, but through the continuous fascial planes that envelop them. The specific chain that connects your ribcage to your face is called the superficial front line. It runs continuously from the plantar surface of your foot, up the front of your leg, through your abdominal wall, across the sternocostal fascia, the front of your ribcage, up through the neck, and into the epicranial fascia, the connected tissue layer that sits over the skull. One sheet, no seams, no interruption. When that sheet shortens at its midpoint, the ribcage, it has mechanical consequences at both ends, which is why a 60-second protocol aimed specifically at restoring ribcage volume is not a cosmetic intervention. It is a structural one. And that distinction is the entire point of what follows. Let me start with how to figure out which version of this problem you're dealing with, because the protocol is not identical for everyone, and applying the wrong emphasis can be less effective than applying the right one. 3 things to observe about your own structure. You can do this right now sitting wherever you are. First, notice your lower ribs at rest. Not during a breath, at rest. Place your hands lightly on your lower sides, just above the waist. In a compressed rib cage, the lower ribs have collapsed inward and the hands sit close to the body. In a flared rib cage, which is a different pattern, more common in people with excessive lumbar curve, the lower ribs splay outward and the hands may feel pushed away from your sides. These are 2 different structural problems that look superficially similar on the face. Second, where does your breath go when you take an unconscious breath? The kind of breath you take when no one is watching and you're not thinking about it. Most people, when they actually check this honestly, discover their breath goes primarily upward. The chest and collarbones rise. The shoulders may subtly lift. The lower and lateral ribcage moves very little. This is clavicular breathing, the pattern of breathing that maintains a compressed thoracic volume because it never asks the ribs to move in the directions that would actually expand the chest. Third, stand with your back against a wall, heels an inch or 2 out, shoulders touching the surface. Is there a gap between the wall and your mid-back, the thoracic region, roughly between your shoulder blades? A gap of more than an inch or 2 in that region suggests thoracic kyphosis, a rounding of the upper back that closes the front of the chest. Can you close that gap without forcing your lower back into the wall? If not, you have some degree of fixed thoracic compression that passive fascial shortening has made structural. These 3 observations put you in one of 3 categories. Call them the compressed pattern, the flared pattern, and the clavicular pattern. The protocol for each is slightly different, and I'll give you the specific instructions for each one. But first you need to understand why the protocol works. And for that, the mechanism matters. Fascia is not padding. This is the first thing to understand if you want to follow the logic of what's happening structurally. For a long time in clinical anatomy, fascia was treated as packaging material, the white stuff you cut through to get to the important things. Dr. Carla Stecco's dissection work at the University of Padua changed that. Her research demonstrated that fascial planes have mechanical continuity and force transmission properties that previous anatomical models had missed, because the dissection process itself destroys the three-dimensional integrity of the fascial network. When you study fascia in a living system, rather than a preserved cadaver, you find that it behaves as a load-distributing sheet, meaning that tension applied at one point is transmitted, attenuated but real, 2 points that are structurally connected along the same plane. This is not exotic. It is the same principle by which pulling one corner of a piece of fabric moves the entire fabric. The superficial front line, the chain we are specifically interested in, has its mechanical fulcrum at the sternocostal junction, the front of the ribcage. When the ribcage maintains its three-dimensional volume, the chain above the sternocostal junction is under what you might call appropriate resting tension, enough to support the structures it envelops, not so much it applies load in the wrong direction. When the ribcage chronically compresses, the chain shortens at this fulcrum. The chain above the fulcrum, the neck, the jaw, the face, is now under different mechanical conditions. The fascia adapts, not contracts, adapts. Over years, it adapts to the shortened position and loses its capacity to return to the longer one. This is called adaptive shortening, and it is well documented in studies published in the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies, examining the relationship between thoracic mobility and cervical alignment. The tissue is not broken. It has learned a new shape. There are 3 specific ways this manifests in the face, and the mechanism I want to describe next is, let me come at this differently, because the intuitive order would go from the most obvious to the least obvious, but the least obvious mechanism actually does the most work, so I want to arrive at it after the other 2. The first mechanism is direct inferior traction. The platysmal fascia, the thin but continuous connective sheet that lies just beneath the skin of the jaw and anterior neck, is continuous with the fascial layer above the sternum. When the sternocostal region shortens, it applies a downward pull on the platysmal fascia. The skin and soft tissue attached to that fascia follows. This is not gravity in the sense we normally mean. It is mechanical traction from below. The distinction matters because collagen treatments and UV protection address neither the platysma nor its inferior traction. The second mechanism is vertical collapse of the cervical scaffold. The cervical spine sits on the thoracic spine. The thoracic spine sits on the ribcage. When the ribcage loses volume, the structural column that positions the head changes its geometry. The forward head position that accompanies thoracic kyphosis shifts the mandible inferiorly and anteriorly relative to its optimal position. In this altered geometry, the soft tissue of the lower face is in a mechanically disadvantaged position. The support from below is compromised. The third mechanism, and this is the one that does the most work, is the respiratory compression loop. Shallow clavicular breathing, which most of us have been doing almost continuously for years, actively prevents the lateral and posterior ribcage expansion that would maintain thoracic volume. Each breath that fails to expand the lateral ribs is a breath that slightly reinforces the compressed position. Over 10,000 breaths per day, over years, this is not trivial. The compression becomes self-maintaining because the respiratory pattern that would interrupt it has been replaced by a respiratory pattern that sustains it. This is similar to how a vehicle chassis that has been gradually bent out of alignment transmits that misalignment through the body of the vehicle, the steering, the wear pattern on the tires, the vibration in the frame. And understanding the chassis this way is itself like working on a chassis. The more you understand how load travels through the structure, the more you automatically begin to notice where your own structure is carrying load it shouldn't be carrying. The analogy enacts what it describes. Thinking in structural terms is already a kind of structural restoration. Fascia responds to sustained length. It is not muscle. It does not respond robustly to brief stretches, but it is also not permanent. It is a living tissue that remodels over months when given consistent mechanical input. The 60-second protocol provides that input at the specific site, the anterior ribcage, where the compression is originating. Before we look at the full protocol, there's something worth addressing about the model most of us have been working with. Collagen loss is real. Elastin degradation is real. Subcutaneous fat in the face does redistribute inferiorly with age. UV exposure accelerates these processes. Genetics shapes how early and how severely they occur. None of this is wrong. The conventional model of facial aging is not incorrect. It is incomplete. Here's the question it cannot fully answer. In clinical populations where thoracic posture is assessed alongside facial aging characteristics, the correlation between thoracic kyphosis severity and the degree of jowl formation is stronger than the model predicts. Two people with nearly identical collagen density and UV history present differently at the jawline, and the difference tracks to thoracic posture more consistently than to the skin variables. This is not a controlled trial. It is a pattern in the clinical record, but it is a pattern that the skin-centric model struggles to explain because it isn't looking at the structures 2 feet below the jaw. There's also something in the cross-cultural record worth noticing. Traditions of bodywork and movement from widely different cultural contexts, Indian pranayama practice, Chinese qigong traditions, certain indigenous ceremonial movement practices documented in postural anthropology research, converge on the ribcage as a central site of bodywork, specifically three-dimensional ribcage expansion. These traditions did not have the anatomy of the superficial front line. They had centuries of observation. What they observed from the outside matches what myofascial anatomy explains from the inside. This does not mean traditional systems were doing what we would call facial rejuvenation work. It means that when people paid sustained attention to how the body holds its breath and its structure, they found the ribcage repeatedly. Worth noting, not more than that. The conventional model also doesn't account for the fact that cultures with load-bearing head carriage traditions, where people habitually carry weight on the head from early life, tend to develop and maintain a thoracic alignment that is measurably different from sedentary Western postural norms. The postural anthropology on this is documented in work examining populations in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. The facial aging patterns in these populations have not been studied systematically through the lens we're discussing. The question, though, is worth asking. Let me give you the protocol. The 60-second ribcage expansion protocol has 3 components. You apply all 3 in sequence, and the whole sequence takes under a minute once the patterns are familiar. The first few times, it may take 2 to 3 minutes because you're learning the direction of the breath. If you're in the compressed pattern, lower ribs collapse inward, minimal lateral movement with breath, you begin with lateral expansion. Sit or stand with reasonable posture. Place your hands on your lower lateral ribs, the sides of your chest, just above your waist. Inhale slowly and send the breath specifically into your hands, not upward, outward. The ribs should press against your palms. If the chest rises and the ribs don't move much laterally, you're recruiting the clavicular pattern. Drop the breath lower. 5 of these breaths, slow, with clear lateral intention. Then move to the posterior. Bring your awareness to the back of your rib cage, the region between and below the shoulder blades. This is harder to feel initially. Breathe into the back of the chest, as though the ribs behind you are expanding outward from the spine. 5 breaths. Finally, a sternocostal lift. Gentle sternal lift. The front of the chest moves slightly upward and forward, with a slow, full inhalation to maximum comfortable volume. 3-second hold at the top. Slow release over 5 seconds. 3 cycles of this. The breath initiates from the lateral rib cage through diaphragmatic engagement, not from the diaphragm into the belly, which is the instruction most people have heard, and which sends the breath inferiorly rather than into the thoracic volume. Lateral rib cage through the diaphragm. The distinction matters because clavicular compensation is exactly what the protocol is trying to not recruit. If you're in the flared pattern, lower ribs splaying outward at rest, modify the protocol by eliminating the anterior sternocostal lift and emphasizing posterior and lateral expansion only. The anterior component may increase the flare. Posterior first, lateral second, 3 slow breaths each. If you're in the clavicular pattern, breath goes upward, minimal ribcage movement. Add a preparatory step before the sequence. Roll a firm towel or place a foam roller on the floor at mid-thoracic level, approximately where your bra strap would sit, or the equivalent point in men. Lie over it with your arms crossed over your chest and simply breathe for 60 seconds, allowing the passive extension of the thoracic spine to begin to open the front of the chest before you actively work the lateral expansion. Then proceed through the compressed pattern protocol. When is optimal? The morning, when you first sit up, before you've had time to reestablish the day's habitual compression. The thoracic fascia is stiffer after a night of sleep position, typically some degree of thoracic flexion, and the protocol is more productive when that stiffness is fresh. But anytime, daily, is better than no time. Consistency over intensity. Once per day, every day, carried through months, changes the mechanical environment. 3 times per day for 1 week, and then never again, does not. After completing the protocol, notice 2 things. The resting position of your jaw, whether it sits slightly differently than it did 60 seconds ago, and the apparent length of your neck, whether the distance between your collarbones and your ears feels subtly longer. These are the immediate mechanical effects of anterior fascial chain lengthening. They are not permanent after a single session. Over weeks and months of consistent practice, the adapted tissue begins to remodel. This is not a promise of specific reversal. Let me be more careful about that word. What the protocol does is reduce the upstream mechanical load that has been contributing to the inferior traction. Whether the tissue fully remodels and over what timeline depends on how long the compression has been present and on individual tissue variability that no protocol can control for. Consider what happens structurally when this changes and what happens structurally when it doesn't. If the rib cage continues to compress, if the anterior fascial chain continues to shorten at the sternocostal fulcrum, the downstream effects continue accumulating. Surface interventions, topical treatments, collagen supporting nutrition, even injectable procedures address the tissue at the end of the chain, while the mechanical input at the beginning of the chain remains unchanged. The water keeps being pushed downhill. The bucket at the bottom fills again. If the rib cage is regularly returned to greater 3-dimensional volume, if the anterior fascial chain is given daily input that maintains a longer resting position, the mechanical environment changes. The inferior traction on the platysmal fascia is reduced. The cervical scaffold sits differently. The tissue at the face is operating under different mechanical conditions. Not reversed conditions necessarily, different ones. And different mechanical conditions mean different mechanical outcomes over the months and years that fascial remodeling operates on. The choice between those 2 futures is not dramatic. It's 60 seconds in the morning. Notice where you are right now. The weight of your rib cage sitting in your chest, whether your lower ribs are pressing outward or sitting quietly collapsed inward. Whether your breath, if you took one right now without thinking about it, would go upward or sideways. Whether your head is sitting over your rib cage or in front of it. These are not abstract questions. The answers live in your body right now in real measurements that fascia has been keeping for years. The face that most of us are worried about is connected through one continuous sheet without gaps through structures that most conversations about facial aging never mention, to that rib cage sitting approximately 2 feet below it. The rib cage that can change, starting tomorrow morning. If what we covered today changed how you understand the relationship between structural posture and facial aging, there's a great deal more territory in that same direction. The places where conventional approaches to the body stop short of the upstream cause, and what to do differently when you understand where to look. Subscribing means that work keeps coming to you directly.